I now welcome the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull AC, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, appearing via video conference. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, Mr Turnbull, could I please get you to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Well, my full name is Malcolm Bligh Turnbull, and I'm appearing in my capacity as an Australian citizen, speaking about the media and the subjects of your inquiry.
Wonderful. Now, I invite you to give us a short opening statement, and then we're going to go to some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Senator, and I just want to say I'm delighted to be appearing before the committee, and I want to thank you for the initiative you've shown in holding this inquiry. Look, I've been involved one way or another with the media for most of my life. I was in the mid-70s. I was a young political correspondent in the New South Wales Parliamentary Press Gallery, and I worked as a journalist here and in the UK. I've also, of course, been involved on the business side of the media industry as an executive with Kerry Packer, as a lawyer with him. I'd also been involved in a lot of very big media transactions over the years. And of course, if you're in politics, you're involved with the media, as you all know, inherently. So I've seen over my life, I've seen a lot of changes. Now, you've had some evidence about the changes to the media because of the rise of the internet, because of social media, because of what that's done to the advertising base of traditional media outlets, particularly newspapers. So I'm very happy to discuss that, but I don't want to delay that in these opening remarks. What I want to speak to is the way in which one media organisation in Australia, the News Corp, that belonging to Rupert Murdoch and his family, has profoundly changed in the way it works on our democracy. You see, media outlets, from time immemorial, really, always sought to achieve a broad audience. When the Sydney Morning Herald was founded in around 1840, it had on its front page the lines from Alexander Pope, "In moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory." Now, I don't think the old Fairfaxes were especially broad-minded politically, but they knew that they needed to get the widest range of opinion, the widest range of readers, because that maximised their advertising. And so mainstream media, a term that's often thrown around, generally sought to be in the mainstream, and narrowcasting was pretty limited, particularly in Australia, and largely confined to the magazine business, where you could have obviously specialist publications. Now, what's happened is that the internet has enabled people to narrowcast and build very substantial commercial businesses on a relatively narrow part of the audience. So this first happened in radio, and then of course, you saw it with cable television, subscription television, and now we have got to the point where many people can effectively live in a news silo, an echo chamber, where their own views or prejudices more often are simply being recycled and confirmed. And this becomes a sort of an ecosystem. And, there is now a market for crazy. And if you doubt the significance of this, just reflect on the damage that Murdoch's publications and outlets, particularly in the United States, have done to democracy there. I mean, the January the 6th sacking of the US Capitol was one of the most terrible events in American history. I mean, the last time there had been people with arms, armed, I should say, sacking the Capitol was during the War of 1812. So this is an extraordinary thing. It underlined the divisions in America that have been, in large part, fomented and promoted by right-wing media, narrowcasting to a section of the population. And in the lead of that, of course, has been Fox News. So you have now, or you had then, a large percentage, a minority thankfully, of Americans, but perhaps a majority of Republican voters who believed that Joe Biden had stolen the election. Now, that was a lie, as we know, but it was one that was pushed and promoted by Murdoch's media. Now, in Australia, a different context, we also see the impact of the way in which News Corp has evolved from being a traditional news organisation or journalistic organisation to one that is essentially like a political party, but it's a party with only one member. And you see the way in which it is used in an aggressive, partisan way to drive particular agendas, whether it is fomenting antagonism and animosity towards Muslims, something I've written about in my book, whether it is obviously the campaign against effective action on climate change, which has been where Murdoch is the principal amplifier and promoter of that in the English-speaking world, at a huge cost to all of us, and to the planet, the whole world. Michael Mann, I know, is talking to you later, and he's literally written a book on this, so he's much more, he can give you chapter and verse better than I can. And, you see this kind of pressure that is brought to bear again and again and again. And I'm telling, a room full of politicians what you live with. You know how intimidated politicians and governments are by the way in which that political power is wielded. I mean, only last week you will have seen the New South Wales government asked me to chair a government committee, which I agreed to do as a good citizen. It wasn't something I was, busting my neck to do, but I was happy to do it, to advise on net zero emissions. A ferocious campaign was launched by the Murdoch media, particularly the Daily Telegraph, and the government crumbled. They could not take the heat. And they acknowledged that. The Premier and the Minister, said Malcolm was the best person for the job and so forth, and we're all still friends. But the saddest thing of it all was the way Matt Keane, the Minister, a good man, very committed to taking action, had to then go to the Daily Telegraph and be quoted in it saying, "Oh, News Corp had nothing to do with this decision." I mean, this is like somebody who was taken down to the police station, beaten over the head until they finally sign a fake confession, the last line of which says, "I confirm that I did so of my own free will." It is this is the profound problem. Now, this is what I would like to discuss with you. I hope you find it interesting. I think it is we face a real threat to our democracy. For example, look at the way news pressured the government to then pressure Facebook and Google to hand large amounts of money to news and, of course, to other media organisations. I mean, it did look like a shakedown. And does anybody know how much those media organisations were paid? Has this committee found out? I don't think so. The reality is, when the power of the Australian Parliament is used to raise money in taxes or levies or whatever, we know about it. It's in the budget papers. It's trawled through at Senate estimates. But the power of you that you represent, your parliament, our parliament, has been used to shake down two big, tech platforms, Google and Facebook, to give money to media companies, the leading protagonist of which was News Corp, and we don't know what they were paid. That's apparently confidential. Perhaps it's too shameful to be revealed. But so we're dealing with a very different proposition. I just summarise it like this. I grew up with newspapers that some of them leant more to the left than to the right, or more to the right than the left, but they, by and large, reported the news as it happened. They had opinion writers that were, across the spectrum, some leaning more one way than the other. That has all changed. News Corp now is like a political party, but with just one member or one family of members. And that is an absolute threat to our democracy. And the Americans saw it on the 6th of January, and nobody is holding them to account. Now, Rudyard Kipling once described the power of the press barons as exercising the prerogative of the harlot, power without responsibility. A bit tough on harlots, I would think. But the reality is that power has to be held accountable. You know, this is the fundamental problem that we're facing. The most powerful political actor in Australia is not the Liberal Party or the National Party or the Labor Party. It is News Corporation, and it's utterly unaccountable. It's controlled by an American family, and their interests are no longer, if they ever were, coextensive with our own.
Thank you, Mr Turnbull. I might go to Senator Fawcett first, and then I know there's some questions that I have as chair and other senators. Senator Fawcett.
I'm happy for you to lead off, Chair.
Okay, all right. Mr Turnbull, you've talked about the immense influence that the Murdoch press has had over issues such as climate change. You have mentioned the example only a week or so ago in relation to the Hunter by-election and the climate committee that you were asked to be on. I thought some of the headlines on the front page of the Daily Telly were worth just referencing. Mal's Cold Shoulder.
Well, it was a classic hit, wasn't it? Yeah.
Malcolm's Coal War. And it goes on. I was reading the editorial in the Daily Telly on one of those days that said, not the right job for a NIMBY, in reference to putting you as chair of that New South Wales committee. And that was a week of relentless media coverage. Is that what you experienced as Prime Minister?
Well, yes, I mean, I did. Not, wasn't like that every day, but I've absolutely experienced bullying and standover tactics from News Corp. And there's no, you could fill a library with examples of it. It is and everyone on this committee knows what I'm saying is true, because you've all lived through it. And, David Fawcett, my, old colleague, has seen it over the years as well as you have. And it is a way to intimidate politicians and get them to do what news or its proprietors want. And look, I don't want to go on about my sort of removal as Prime Minister, but I think, as everyone knows, as the record shows, News Corp were part of that, conspiracy that put the coup in action. Murdoch solicited Kerry Stokes' support for it, as Kerry told me, and it was, you just got to read the newspapers, right? So, and indeed what Murdoch said to me directly. So the bottom line is they are very, very substantial players, but they have it's a very targeted political operation nowadays, and the partisanship of it is extraordinary. I get back, we haven't had a January the 6th episode in Australia, thank heavens. But if you think about that, the damage that has done to America, I ask you this question: what does Vladimir Putin want to do with his operations in America? He wants to divide America and turn Americans against each other, and he wants to undermine faith in their democratic institutions. That's his agenda. That's absolutely established in the intelligence community. That's what he's been seeking to do. That is exactly what Murdoch has done. Divided Americans against each other and so undermined their faith in their political institutions that a mob of thousands of people many of them armed, stormed the Capitol, and, thank heavens, it didn't result in legislators being killed or hung or lynched, as some of them were proposing to do. So we can't get away from this reality that this is enormous damage being done to our democracy. The challenge is, what do you do about it?
Can I ask you then, do you believe that News Corp here in Australia aims to divide the country?
Well, it certainly does, yes. Again, we're a different country to the United States, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Probably don't have time to do. But if you look at the way the News Corp tabloids, for example, regularly seek to incite animosity towards minorities, particularly Muslims. It was a huge issue while I was Prime Minister, because everything I was doing was obviously designed to reinforce our success as a multicultural society. And what is so frustrating is that these voices on the populist right, particularly from Murdoch's organisation, are essentially doing the work of the terrorists. What a terrorist says to a young Muslim is, they hate you, they don't want you, you're not one of them. You can never be an Australian, right? That's the message. So the counter argument to that, and this is obvious, is to say, you are one of us, you are an Australian, we're a multicultural society, we love you and respect you, and all faiths, all races, all religions are welcome here and part of our multicultural society. So, look, Senator, ultimately you've got to judge people's policies and programs by their consequences. And I just am saying that it's self-evident that the way the Murdoch press has operated both here and in the US has been absolutely adverse to our national interest. And in the US, their agenda appears to be effectively the same, I'm not saying it's coordinated or motivated by, effectively the same as that of America's most trenchant adversaries.
Can I ask you about your engagement with News Corp and Murdoch when you were Prime Minister? Did you ever receive phone calls or requests for meetings to discourage you from following through on a particular policy agenda? What was your engagement with News Corp like as Prime Minister?
Well, look, I probably am a slightly different situation to most Australian politicians, because I've known Rupert Murdoch and his family for a very, very long time. And I first met Rupert, I think would have been around 1976 or something like that. So I've known him for a very long time, well over 45 years plus. So look, basically they have an agenda.
What is their agenda, Mr.
Their agenda is obviously they are opposed to effective action on climate change. So that's a hot button for them. They are obviously very supportive of the kind of right-wing agenda in the United States. Trump was to some extent a creation of Rupert Murdoch. I've hung around, billionaire media proprietors for a long time. I hung around them and known them. I have never seen a politician as deferential to a media proprietor as Trump was to Murdoch, ever, in any country. And so that was and so Murdoch's media in the US it had a sort of symbiotic relationship with Trump. Fox, who was Fox News like state-owned media in an authoritarian country, always apologising, not holding to account its favoured government, in this case Trump's, or was the media in control of Trump? I know they fell out at the very end but it's a very, very peculiar relationship. Now in Australia, again, it's somewhat different. But you look at the way the Murdoch press do not hold the Morrison government to account in the way they've held previous governments to account. That's self-evident. And the government therefore feels that it is less accountable. You know, that good question that Lee Sales asked Josh the other day. What do you have to do to get sacked as a minister in this government? And Josh struggled to find an answer. I think I can understand why. If I could just make one other point, though, which is I've talked about an ecosystem before, and the Liberals, Nationals on this committee will understand very keenly what I'm talking about. Because of the way in which we've got into these information silos or news opinion silos, you get a situation that many of the branch members in the LNP and the rusted-on supporters rely heavily on Sky News, 2GB if they're in New South Wales, and the Murdoch tabloids for their news, right? And so it becomes like an echo chamber, and one is feeding and driving the other. And so, you know, there's a very good line, you know, revelation from Ted O'Brien, you know, a guy who's actually quite progressive, was a Republican, and he was chairman of the Republican movement at one point, explaining to me why, as a Queensland member, he had to support Dutton's coup attempt. And he said, it's as though my branch members are having a meeting with Alan Jones and Peter Credlin every night. And so the influence of this very political media organisation is vastly greater on the coalition than it is on the community at large. And again, you see the same pattern in the United States. It's where right-wing media, particularly Murdoch's, has pulled the Republican Party to the right. I mean, John Boehner, the former Speaker, has just written a book which deals with this. So, you know, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it has a very big impact on our democracy. And the challenge is, what do you do about it?
When you were Prime Minister, Mr Turnbull, did you often think about how, should I do this, should I do that, should I discipline this member, should I push forward on this policy based on what was going to be printed on the front page of the Daily Telegraph or the Australian the next day?
Well, of course, you have to take all those things into account. You see, it's easy to say, for example, like people will say, oh, you know, the New South Wales government, Matt Keane, Gladys, were very weak to give in to the bullying from the Telegraph last week. That's a fair comment, and privately I don't think they'd argue with it. But on the other hand, they're dealing with reality. I mean, is a government weak, quote unquote, because it makes concessions to the crossbench in the Senate in order to get legislation passed? Well, of course it's not weak. If it wants to get the legislation passed, it's got to do a deal. We all understand that. The point is that Murdoch's media do not operate here in the way other media organisations do. They are highly political, highly partisan. So again, it's not like a newspaper.
Highly political, highly political and highly partisan, yet totally unelected.
Correct, and that's the point. That is the point. So if any of you, you know, say something or do something, you can be held to account for it. Mm. And the electorate really find what you're doing objectionable, they can tip you out at the next election.
Can I ask you...
Murdoch is completely unaccountable.
Hmm. Can I ask you before going, I know other people have questions, just last one from me, Mr Turnbull. Do you have to leave politics before you can speak out on these issues?
Well, if you want to stay in politics, if you certainly want to stay in politics on the coalition side, yes. I mean, you've got to be, I was, of all the coalition leaders at least in, the last 30 odd years, I was by far the least deferential to Murdoch, and I think he always resented that. But I'm not a very deferential person. I hope I'm courteous, but I'm not very good at sucking up. But, effectively you now have, as you had with Abbott, a sort of symbiotic relationship between News Corp and the Prime Minister and his office, right? And it is almost a coalition government. And, these are these are really uncomfortable things to confront. But we have to recognise that the way news operates is very different to the way Fairfax operates or the ABC operates or the Guardian operates. It is highly partisan, highly targeted, and its operations are politically very instrumental in the sense that they're designed to achieve outcomes, whether that is protecting their mates, getting rid of people they don't like, or whatever, or, sort of stopping action on climate. I mean, I'll just give you one example on climate, which is a good one. And Michael Mann will give you a lot more. But at the beginning of last year, when the bushfires were at their worst, in Sydney, Matt Keane gave a speech about climate policy, in which it was a conventional speech. It was a good speech, but there was nothing revolutionary or radical or anything like that. But he basically did say, well, the fires demonstrate that our climate's getting hotter with global warming, and hotter and drier means more fires, right? True. The attack on him in the Telegraph following that was bitter, vicious and personal. And what it was designed to do was not just to punish him, but it sends a message. And this is how it operates like a gang, like a mafia gang. It sends a message. If you step out of line, you'll cop some of this too. That's the threat. So that other politicians look at that and they say, oh gosh, I don't want to go there. So, that is the reality. So we shouldn't criticise, we can criticise politicians for giving into this, but the fact is they've got to live with it. It's a force, and it needs to be more called out.
Thank you. Senator Carr.
Thank you, Mr Turnbull. Thank you very much for appearing today. Could I just follow up the question that the Chair's just asked you, and I think a similar question was asked of Kevin Rudd. Is it the case that you only discover your courage on this issue when you actually are removed from office?
Well, I don't think that's right, Senator. I mean, Kevin had a very different, as you know, you're a member of the Labor Party, remember part of his governments. He had a very different relationship with News Corp than I did. At different times he was very close to them. I don't think that hasn't ever been the case in my case. But certainly being as candid as I have been today is something that you would do at your peril if you were a Prime Minister or a Minister or wanting to keep, staying in Parliament, because the retribution would be very intense. And even if you were prepared to take the heat, your colleagues definitely wouldn't.
Yes, so the point that you make is that the News Limited operates as a political party, and you've said this with one family of members, and they're effectively unaccountable for the use of that power. Can you enlarge on that proposition in terms of any evidence that you can point to? I mean, specifically perhaps the issue that relate to the Clean Energy Board case from just recent times. Would that be
look, to be honest, that is by News's standards, that's a minor, that's just an example of how they operate. It's hardly the worst thing they've done. I mean, I think you all, unless you've got to the point where you lose sight of the wood for the trees, you all know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, you see it. You see the campaigns. I mean, Kevin Rudd, to his credit, has done a good job, I think, in showing the way in which the news tabloids have flayed Labor state governments for their, failings on the management of the pandemic, but been very gentle in its treatment of Liberal ones. Now, that's another example, but there's no point. Look, again, I honestly, this is an area that you are actually living in.
Yes.
In this environment. I mean, the problem is, are you and other politicians, and I'm not directing this particularly to you, Senator, but are politicians, or are perhaps Australians generally, with this problem that we face with News Corp, are we a bit like the frog who gets into the saucepan, the water seems nice and warm for a while, and then by the time he realises it's boiling, it's too late. I mean, has this crept up on us?
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. The question arises, however, in terms of what we do about this, and there's been some debate, evidence presented to the committee from the Institute for Public Affairs, the Australian Press Council type of argument that says, look, we've really got a highest level of media diversity than we've ever had. You know, it's suggested to us that rather than the argument, which I must say I personally have presented, that we've got one of the highest levels of media concentration in the world in this country, that this is not really a problem in the eyes of some people, that the IPA, for instance, says that there's much greater levels of diversity now. There's a report that's just been published from the Associate Professor of Communications, Bernadette Beverin, and PhD candidates Michael Ward, which has just done a recent study, has found that news has now 59% share in metro and national print media markets measured by readership, and that was compared to 25% in 1984. That Nine, on the other hand, owners of the Fairfax papers, the old Fairfax papers, has a combined readership of some 23%. Would you comment on that? And specifically, given the media reforms that you introduced in 2017, could you comment on whether or not the question of media diversity is something that we should have attended to over some time, given your frog analogy?
It's a good question. The internet and associated technologies have made it cheaper than ever to both make and distribute news content, news and information, whether it's straight news or opinion or mixture of both. So at one level, there are certainly more channels available than ever. However, what has happened is, the argument about concentration is absolutely right. Particularly with newspapers, the concentration is at a level, I would think, without precedent in any other comparable country, and particularly in Queensland. And again, I've read some of the excellent submissions made to your committee, and there's plenty of statistics there. I won't go over them. But, excuse me, I do think the biggest problem is the fact that the News Corp outlets in particular are being used in a highly politicised way, a highly partisan way, akin to a political party. So it's not a case any longer of a newspaper that, does a fairly straight job, consistent with its format, but then leans one way or another at election time. It is now full-on propaganda, complete with targeting individuals, vendettas, and, ideological campaigns like the whole campaign against action on global warming. And of course, there are counterparts, on some of the shock jocks, particularly in Sydney, have been examples of that too. So, again, the thing that we've got to have our eyes open to is the end of this.Here does this end? Yeah. Well, we saw that on the 6th of January. We saw that we've seen this in the way effective action on climate has been frustrated again and again and again in Australia and, frankly, in the United States. Let's hope Joe Biden, has a better run at it. But so these are very real consequences. And we can't, and this is why I think, I'm not a big fan of royal commissions, as you know, but I think this is why a thoroughgoing royal commission with all of its powers of investigation is very worthwhile.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Because I want to come back to this issue, though, in terms of previous attempts at media diversity. The 2017 reforms that you championed actually were about removing the 2 out of 3 cross-media control rules. Do you think in retrospect there's any cause for regret about that, given that there has to been an increase in media concentration since that period?
Well, no, I don't regret it, but I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't review all these things regularly, because things change. But I just say this: the biggest opponent to removing the 2 out of 3 rule was in fact Murdoch. And if you go back a few years, Murdoch actually attacked me personally in some tweets. I'm getting some feedback. I don't know whether that's maybe someone's not on mute. But anyway, Murdoch attacked me over that because he said this is simply to enable Turnbull's friends at Nine to buy Fairfax, to merge with Fairfax, which Murdoch did not want to happen because he wanted Fairfax to wither. And I think that the merger of Nine, the television company, and Fairfax has resulted in a stronger rival to News Corp. So, you know, again, that's the, I mean, if you want, like, you know, all of this is sort of his retrospective review, right? I think the single biggest mistake that was made by far was the decision in '87 by the Hawke government, principally at Paul Keating's behest, to allow Murdoch to buy the Herald and Weekly Times, because that gave him the domination of metropolitan daily newspapers, and that was just a massive mistake.
Mm-hmm. Can I press you on this issue about how we actually improve the level of media diversity? There's others have argued that there needs to be a greater emphasis on philanthropic assistance to improve the level of investment, given the changes that have occurred through the digitalisation of the industry. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that, and could you perhaps reflect upon the proposition that's been advanced by the Public Interest Journalism Initiative that's suggested that an R&D tax type of incentive arrangement be used for the taxation system. Do you think there's any merit in finding alternative means to encourage investment to actually rebuild media diversity in the country?
Look, I think you know, philanthropists, whether it's Judith Nielsen or others, or Graham Wood, of course, who was the supported The Guardian when it was starting in Australia. These are very, very important contributors. I mean, is American democracy enhanced by Jeff Bezos's support of the Washington Post? Clearly it is, whatever you may think of Amazon or Jeff Bezos in other contexts. I think we've got to address. We're going to have to think imaginatively and laterally here, because we do have a problem. I mean, I'd commend to you an essay that was written in the New York Times Magazine last year by Emily Bazelon about this issue, and she makes the point there that the whole concept of freedom of speech in the US, the First Amendment, is premised on the proposition that in the conflict of ideas, the truth will prevail. In the battle of ideas, the truth will prevail. Regrettably, increasingly, we're seeing we are drowning in lies. And part of that is due to the ability to narrowcast that I was talking about earlier. I mean, a good example where I really learnt my lesson on that was in 2016, when the Labor Party's audaciously outrageous Mediscare lie, that we were going to sell Medicare, which was laughed out of every television studio in the country, nonetheless got enormous traction and was very, very potent and damaging to us in a number of electorates because it was being channeled directly through social media and digital, text messages and so forth. So the bottom line is the idea that the truth prevails, the proposition that the truth prevails in the battle of ideas is really being tested at the moment. And so, you need, for example, I mean, some media, the old Fairfax newspapers are a good example of this, are very reluctant to publish anything critical of News Corp. There's a sort of a KOG there. The truth is that the media have to hold each other for account. I mean, obviously News Corp never holds back in its attacks on the ABC, which is like an obsession, but we're just going to have to stop media proprietors exercising that power without responsibility. And, I wish I had a single one-line answer for you. I don't, but we cannot blind ourselves to the problem we're facing.
And the government's mandatory code has been given particular attention. What's your view on that? Is that an answer to the question of media diversity?
Well, no, I think it's really problematic. I mean, it looks and feels like a shakedown. I'm not, sort of trying to defend Google and Facebook at all. I think it's actually pretty outrageous. We would have been better off. We would have been better off having a digital services or digital advertising tax, and then, which cut across the board, rebate that to organisations who employed a lot of journalists, and then have the balance, bulk of it, which would come from Google and Facebook and similar platforms, distributed in a manner to actually support journalism. I mean, we're going to have to start being prepared to make subjective decisions about quality of journalism and news, as we used to, under the Broadcasting Act. I mean, when I was a young broadcasting lawyer, we had triennial licence renewals, and you had to be a fit and proper person. You had to demonstrate that your news services were balanced. All those, people were accountable. But nowadays, that's out of fashion, and I think that was a mistake.
So there's been other proposals, such as that by a group of ex-editors of the major mastheads who have made a submission of this inquiry and suggested that we should be direct grants allocated by a statutory body at arm's length from government to support new and smaller publishers. What's your view on that proposal?
Well, I think that could be very worthwhile. I think we all have a vested interest in greater diversity, but we cannot pretend that there isn't an issue about quality, for example, I'll give you a good example. If you take the News Corp newspapers and The Guardian, right? Now, The Guardian is one of the great newspapers in the English language, obviously, but it undoubtedly leans to the left. It is a small L liberal, left-ish newspaper, very unlikely to recommend a vote for the centre-right parties in any election. But they don't make stuff up. They don't run vendettas. They do check facts. It's a professional operation. That is no longer the case with news. And the decline of The Australian, which so many experienced newspaper people from news, and indeed privately within news, make the same observation. So what's happened is there has been a step from being publications and media outlets that tend to lean one way in terms of their philosophy to full-blown propaganda. And that is, people like Paul Kelly I quoted on that in my book, would blame that on social media. Well, that may have contributed to it, but we're living with the consequences.
Several witnesses have put to us in terms of accountability and complaint mechanisms that there is very limited opportunity for individuals and for groups to be able to get a response to adverse treatment by the media. The Press Council is often cited. There's been a very strong criticism of the Press Council by a number of submitters. One, it's not resourced, it's not actually able to deal with complaints, that it's actually dominated by the proprietors. I'm wondering if you could give us a view on whether or not there are better remedies to provide assistance to people to give a counter view when they've been mistreated, rather than the woefully expensive libel defamation procedures, which are not available to organisations in any event.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Look, I used to be a defamation lawyer, but it's a very long time ago. But I've always felt that a good reform would be something like this, where you would say that if a person, call them the plaintiff, feels they've been defamed, if they bring their complaint to a publisher and the publisher within a reasonable time, whether it's a week or 2 weeks, detail, publishes a correction and apology, then, in an equally prominent position, then they should not be able to get damages other than actual pecuniary damages. So if their business revenues were halved, they could be compensated for that. In other words, to provide an incentive for media outlets to get the facts straight quickly. Because, you see, we look at defamation often as a battle between the individual's right to his or her reputation and the publisher's right of free speech. But there's also a third interest, which is the public's interest to timely and accurate information on matters of, public and other affairs. And so I think that's, that was an approach that I, canvassed many years ago, to be probably for good reason. I couldn't get a lot of traction for it or support for it. But, you're absolutely right. I mean, journalists are very fond of complaining about how tough it is, the defamation laws are, but the resources of an individual faced, with the might of a media company are just so minuscule. So for it's fine for billionaires and, maybe politicians who can get the resources to sue, but for the average person, they're just completely outmatched. And so I think we do have to think about how people can get their reputations restored and how publishers have a real incentive to get their facts straight. Because in my experience, most defamations are the result of mistakes, and particularly in this environment where journalists are having to write copy instantly, and there's no longer there's no longer, hours or days of a deadline. You're basically having to write it instantly. It is much easier and perhaps more inevitable to make mistakes.
And of course, organisations don't have even defamation actions, or are not able to. A union, for instance, cannot get any support or cannot take legal action and defend their reputation if they're challenged, particularly when they're faced with a campaign of vilification. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think I think that's perhaps the right area is not defamation law, but something analogous to the action that corporations can bring under Section 52, or they can effectively bring a claim against a publisher for having published misleading or deceptive material about them and recover damages in that way. So look, the days when I was very knowledgeable about this, I'm afraid, are decades in the past. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just checking, Senator Fawcett, you're okay, or you?
Just a couple of quick questions, if I can. Thanks.
Great.
Chair, Mr. Turnbull, good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
You expressed some concerns about the effects of media concentration on our democracy. And one of our previous hearings, we canvassed the fact that in Queensland, where there was statistical evidence to say that the News Corp had bought a number of mastheads and dominated the print media, that in fact the Labor Party had won the vast majority of elections. Just wondering if you'd like to comment on how that concentration of media hasn't in fact affected the outcomes in the way that some people were expressing concern that it would.
Yeah, well, look, you notice that I've not, this is a point that Kevin Rudder's made, and I think it's a fair point, but I don't think it's the whole picture. The problem, the reality is that, and you'd understand this very well as a member of the Liberal Party, the reality is that the sort of Murdoch media are much more influential within the coalition than they are in the electorate at large. Just like Fox News in the States is much more influential among Republican voters than it is in the electorate at large. I mean, you know, Trump would have won the election if it was that influential. So what Murdoch's media has done in the States and here is pull the coalition in our case, the Republicans in the US, further to the right. Now, it's not the only force doing that, but it's a very big part of it. In terms of Queensland, there is no question that the sort of inaction, if you like, on climate that you see across the political divide is connected to the influence of the Murdoch media. I mean, again, I'm not, you don't want to be like, don't let yourselves be like Matt Keane and have the indignity of having to say, Murdoch's media are completely balanced and fair and, don't bully governments or don't deny climate action. We've got to be honest about it and recognise that we do have this challenge. And it doesn't always result in Liberal governments being elected or supported at all, because the influence of that right-wing media ecosystem is most significant in the context of the coalition base itself. And I mean, again, you're still in the business, but I'm not so long out of it that I don't remember very keenly how that ecosystem operates.
Sure. The other question I had, you've mentioned a couple of times the concept of personal vendettas. Over the last decade in Australian politics, I've heard Fairfax accused of running vendettas. You've accused News Corp of running vendettas. There are people currently accusing the ABC of running vendettas in the media, depending on where people come from. But in September 2015, the ABC did an analysis of some of the claims about the impact of media on our leadership stability. And they quoted Bruce Hawker, who said that leaking is probably more of a concern than what Alan Jones or Andrew Bolt might say in terms of the impact on our democracy, the stability of governments and leaderships. Just wondering if you'd like to comment on his observation.
Well, look, I haven't seen the context in which he said it, Senator, but the reality is that what, the Sky News commentators after dark, what the Murdoch tabloids say, what, the shock jocks at 2GB say, is vastly, vastly more influential on the coalition side of politics. I mean, that's the reality. So, Senator Hanson-Young, Senator Carr, if they get slammed every night on Sky News, it isn't going to affect their pre-selections. It's probably not going to affect whether anyone votes for them. But if there was a full tilt campaign against you, you would feel that in your pre-selection in South Australia, and you know that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Mr Turnbull, whether either prior to being Prime Minister or during your time or since, have you had any conversations with Mr Murdoch about climate change and climate science?
Yes, we're talking about Rupert Murdoch now, and it's a long time since I've discussed anything much with Lachlan Murdoch, to be honest. Look, Rupert, in my experience, tends to sidestep conversations like that. I mean, I regularly said to him before I was PM, but particularly while I was PM, why are you allowing this campaign against me and my government to continue? The only winner of this is going to be our opponents, the Labor Party. And of course, there was this crazy agenda that Rupert acknowledged to me that was being pushed by Paul Whittaker and, apparently with Lachlan's support, which was that my leadership should be overthrown or damaged to an extent that one way or another we would lose the 2019 election and Tony Abbott could come back as opposition leader and then return us to glorious victory in 2022. Now, this sounds completely unhinged, and it may well be so, but there's no doubt that that was being undertaken, and I had a direct conversation with Rupert about it, which I might say Clive Matheson was my chief of staff, was the witness and took very good notes. So there's no question. I know what he said to Stokes, and of course we saw what they were doing. So there's crazy stuff here, but equally look at the United States. I mean, could you really have credited that a major cable news network would have supported the proposition that Joe Biden had stolen the election, even though it was clearly untrue, and with consequences that resulted in the American Capitol, their parliament, being sacked by a mob of thousands of people who believed what they'd seen on Fox News? I mean, and if you don't think that isn't a threat to American democracy and undermining the strength and capability of our most important ally, then, you are kidding yourself.
One of the things that we've consistently heard from other witnesses and variety of submissions, and this is in the context of the influence of and the concentration of the Murdoch press here in Australia. Now, when we had Michael Miller present to our hearing a number of sessions ago, he was very keen to downplay the media concentration, arguing that, we've got newspapers, but there's all these radio stations and television stations and online media that we don't have anything to do with. However, the evidence that we keep being presented with is that what is on the front page of those newspapers every morning sets the tone and the agenda for the rest of the media for the rest of the day. So if there's a front page article on the Daily Telegraph criticising you as being a NIMBY, that then gets picked up by morning radio, morning television, and before you know it, the evening news that day is all about whether you're going to be sacked. And is that a fair assessment, that these newspapers run the agenda for everybody else?
I think the papers still set the agenda, not as much as they did when I was a reporter in the 1970s, but there's no doubt, there's a lot of what you say is largely correct. I think the other thing is that they are utterly liberated from the truth. So and again, Trump kind of embodied this most incredibly as president, but they don't care about lying. They don't care about making stuff up. I mean, I don't want to talk about myself and, this incident last week, but it's current and it's a nice little case study. In one of apart from representing me as an anti-coal activist NIMBY, for daring to object to the extension of an massive open-cut coal mine, close to our, grazing property in the Hunter Valley. And of course, bear in mind what that is. That sends a message to anybody else that dares to object to the expansion of the coal industry. If you dare to do that, you too can be sort of scarified on the front page of the Telegraph. And while I've got a thick hide, as I'm sure all the members of this committee do, the average person is just mind-blowing and terrifying, that prospect. But in one of the editorials that Telegraph wrote about my shortcomings, they said that Mr. Turnbull wants to shut down the whole coal industry, which is actually quite the reverse of what I was saying. What I was saying was that, we've got export demand is declining for reasons we all understand. There is more than sufficient capacity in existing mines, and the sort of willy-nilly expansion of coal mining there, in addition to all the environmental negatives, both local and global, is actually putting the jobs in the existing mines at risk. But you know, that's a detail. You see, the facts don't matter. They will make stuff up, and that's where you get that same culture. It is propaganda. It's not news anymore. It's propaganda, and it has a purpose, and that is to pursue their agenda. You know, political, environmental, whatever.
In terms of ensuring media diversity, and obviously if we've got this propaganda machine that has huge political influence, and I think it's interesting and important to note here that we've had both yourself as a former Liberal Prime Minister and we've had Kevin Rudd as a former Labor Prime Minister. So in many ways, this cuts across the traditional partisan divides. If there's a problem with media diversity, is it that we simply have to boost the ability for the alternatives to participate in the daily public interest journalism, whether that's the ABC, whether that's encouraging more other independent and smaller outfits? Is that the way to do it, or does there need to be a specific dismantling of the power of News Corp?
Well, look, I think probably all of the above. The ABC is more important than ever because it is bound by its act to present accurate news and balanced commentary. Can't remember the exact words. It's in Section 8, but it's there. And so, you know, one of the points I used to make as whether it's Comms Minister or the PM to the ABC was you can't go down the same sort of opinionated, propagandistic rabbit hole as the other media because you're not like the other media. You've got an obligation, a statutory obligation they don't have. And I think my criticisms of the ABC were not of being biased, politically biased, but actually of what I thought was in some cases a decline in journalistic standards, you know, like not checking facts. You know, I felt there could have been at times, you know, more and better editorial leadership. And, you know, that's where I give Lenore Taylor great credit at The Guardian. You know, whatever you think of The Guardian's leanings, or, you know, if you think it's too far to the left or, you know, whatever, or not left enough, you know, Lenore is a tough, disciplined editor, and that's important. Getting the facts straight and not making stuff up is important. So I think, yes, alternatives should be encouraged. I do think the extent of, daily newspaper ownership, particularly in Queensland, is right out of control now. Particularly in Queensland, I'm not a Queenslander, obviously, but I think the points that Kevin makes are very powerful ones. And, more diversity would have to be a good thing. I think AAP also needs to be supported. I'm glad the government gave it $5 million. I mean, Murdoch, of course, as you all know, was trying to put it out of business and replace it with a newswire service controlled by News Corp. But I think the survival of AAP as an independent newswire service is really important, because what it's doing is providing the bulk of the news copy for a lot of, smaller publishers, whether they're broadcast or print or just online.
Yes, Senator Carr. Okay, yes, you can. Yes.
Gather your thoughts. Mr. Turnbull, a matter I raised with you before regarding the 2017 reforms, you said that you thought that the proposals that you advanced were opposed by Murdoch, and it's been brought to my attention that Lachlan Murdoch, in fact, proposed, had a bid in at the time for 10 and was dependent upon the changes that those 2017 measures involved, that is the repeal of the 2 out of 3 rule, was actually critical for his bid. And a point that Tim Warner was then the CEO of Seven pointed out, and that the ACCC approval had actually been organised before the law was actually passed, but the fact that Lachlan in fact had misjudged the situation because the CBS bid had come in and essentially outmanoeuvred him. But the claim was that Murdoch opposed this was in fact not quite right in the light of the actual events at the time. I do say that just in the sense that if we're looking at the development of media regulation here, then no one comes to this with clean hands. Is that...
Senator, I'm not... these issues have been around for a long time. I can assure you that for quite a while, the only media group that strongly supported or supported at all changing the 2 out of 3 rule was Fairfax and Nine, because there was the option of a merger. And it absolutely was opposed by Murdoch. I mean, eventually everybody got on board, and that's why it happened. But it was, because you see, effectively, Murdoch had effective control of 10 until Lachlan managed to bungle the whole insolvency, and as we know, CBS got control of it. But he had effective control of 10, and so would have preferred that Fairfax did not get controlled by Nine or merge with Nine. So, in fact, I mean, there was a... I could find it for you, probably, but you'll find. I think it would have been in 2014 or 15 where I'd advocated this reform, and there was quite a stinging tweet from Murdoch about it, having a go at me. So
right.
So yes, I mean, but it is eventually everybody got on board, and there are all sorts of arrangements and amendments made to try to keep everyone satisfied. I mean, media policy is diabolical, and your side's had the same problem because as Sam Chisholm used to say, these proprietors are all founder members of the We Want the World Society, and so keeping them happy is pretty hard.
Can I just come back to another point you raised? You said you've had spoken directly to Murdoch in regard to some of these issues on climate change, but there have been some sidestepping of the issues. Can I ask what's the nature of a conversation with the executive leadership of News Corp in Australia about the way in which the Australian outlets have actually treated the climate change issue and what you call what should be an issue of physics into an issue of values and identity?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I can't recall any specific conversations with local leadership about it. I mean, it was the best. I'll find this for you now, but the best discussion, the frankest discussion I've had with anyone from News about this was with Paul Kelly, and I refer to this in my book. And I say I've had a chat with Paul Kelly, and this is in 2017. We agreed that what has happened is that the mainstream media has become disaggregated and marginalised by social media and an infinite range of additional channels on the internet. These new channels are invariably hysterical, extreme, often fact-free, and in order to maintain attention, the mainstream media has gone the same way, so that now even a broadsheet like The Australian is full of prejudiced extreme opinion because that is what drives traffic, clickbait. Fairfax and even the ABC have been equally infected. This, of course, is what Paul is saying. So the media discourse is now extreme and destructive everywhere, and we see the consequence: Trump, Le Pen, Brexit, etc. Kelly observed that at News, and especially on Sky, the view is that I have to be destroyed because I'm too left-wing, no better than Shorten, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Indeed, he says on Sky they've lost all interest in Australian politics as a struggle between Labor and the coalition. Rather, their fascination is between Turnbull, the soft centrist, and Tony Abbott, the muscular conservative, who let them down again and again. Crazy times. So that's a note I made at the Times in my book. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit more of that in my book, but that's, I mean, who's got a better insight into what's changed at News Corp than Paul, And that is but he's a captive too, right? He wouldn't be in a position to say that publicly because he'd be writing, writing for the conversation, I guess, if he did that.
Mr Turnbull, we've talked a bit about News Corp's agenda and response in relation to climate change and their and how they've derailed action. I want to ask, from your perspective, what News Corp's treatment of women has been in Australia. Obviously, you would have seen the way Julia Gillard was treated as Prime Minister. There's plenty other examples of the way news coverage has dealt with other women in public life. Gillian Triggs comes to mind as somebody specifically that's been referenced by other submitters to us. How have you witnessed their engagement of women, and do you think that perhaps there is a difference between your prime ministership and Julia Gillard's prime ministership in terms of how News Corp and even other media covered and responded?
Well, look, the treatment of Gillard was shameful. I mean, and it was pushed very strongly by the News Corp tabloids, and of course most notoriously by Alan Jones, who, while he, in his radio job, he works with the Macquarie Group, or used to. He also works for Sky. Look, this is this is a deeply. It's this sort of. I don't know. It's just this deep misogyny that you see in the right-wing political ecosystem. I mean, again, I'm not telling any of you something you don't know, but I mean, has there ever been a male politician whose body shape has been commented on the way Gillard's was, whose constant criticism of the way she dressed? But I mean, there is a deep misogyny in our political system, and I sought to address that as Prime Minister. In fact, I did seek to address it. I'm not saying I resolved it, not at all, but I did seek to address it. But it's a fundamental problem. And I have to say, with all due respects to Scott Morrison, when he said the other day, "Oh, other workplaces are like this too," that is completely and utterly untrue. Now, I give him credit that he basically hasn't had much experience outside of politics. So maybe he just wasn't aware. But in the standards that you put up with in Parliament, you're all too familiar with, are not completely at odds with modern Australia, whether it's in, the public service environment or the corporate world or whatever. So, but yeah, I mean, I think again you could find plenty of examples of this, but the pursuit of Gillard was really one of the most shameful episodes. But to give her credit, her misogyny speech was one of the most powerful counterpunches I've ever seen in politics.
Mm. How about the way the media and particularly News Corp represents the opposition to those who they support? And I guess I'm thinking here in particular how News Corp covered Bill Shorten as opposition leader, or other, you talk about an agenda. You talk about News Corp being effectively a political party in their own right now, working in coalition government with the Morrison government. How, if it's that members on your side of government or your side of parliament would be afraid to stand up or take on by virtue of what that would mean for the base, could you give some reflection of how the opposition is treated?
Well, I think it's probably better for someone from the Labor side to address that. But I think the News Corp supports the coalition much more than the Labor Party, although they did support Kevin Rudd years ago. And Kevin certainly had a close relationship for many years. Again, one that I didn't have, nor did I seek one. But I think they've got mates who they do not hold accountable and they protect, and they target their friends' opponents, and they bully people. And in terms of running a vendetta against somebody, they're basically sending a message to everybody else, right? I mean, it's one of the selling points that Dutton's people were making in August 2018 was, we've got News Corp supporting us, and they were citing discussions with senior people at News Corp. But I mean, it was obvious. You didn't need to have that whispered to you in a corridor. You could see it. And so this is the point is, they are, I think, the single most influential political player in Australia, but they are unelected and they are utterly unaccountable. And that's that is what we're talking about. So, and they do not hold themselves to traditional journalistic standards of, accuracy and balance and so forth. Now, they would say, oh, look, it's a business model. We've got, a percentage of the population who love being told this stuff, and they like the extreme political views, and so that's what we're going to do. And Fox News in the States is commercially very successful. But that's not a justification that, we can tolerate if the consequences are so much damage to our democracy. Again, you can't get around from that. Would the 6th of January have occurred, would America be as divided and therefore weaker as it is today without the efforts of Murdoch? And he has done so much damage to the United States that people are scared to hold him to account because of the consequences, because they don't want to be the next person on the vendetta list. That's the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Thank you so much for your time today. And,
thank you. It's been good to see you all again.
Thank you. And of course, if this inquiry is continuing for some time, so if there's anything else that comes to mind that you think we should be aware of, please don't hesitate to get in contact with the Secretariat.
And ditto, Senator, if there's anything, other matters you want to raise with me, happy to reappear or answer questions in writing as you see fit.
Sorry, Senator Carr has a question.
Mr. Turnbull, I asked you a series of questions about what actions can be taken in regard to improving diversity. If you have any further thoughts on that, particularly around the use of the taxation system, I'd appreciate any supplementary advice that you would like to tender. I'm specifically interested in models that perhaps would use the existing R&D tax concession administered by the Taxation Office, with setting out particular framework, but for specific public interest journalism, with the standards issue addressed, the that you've referred to, or other measures you can contemplate. Thank you.
Sure. No, thank you very much. I'll reflect on that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr Turnbull, and we're just going to take a short suspension.